In the words of my dear colleague and dear friend, Dr. Sarah Schulist, who's a linguistic anthropologist, words matter. And so it's at this point in the term that we're going to turn to looking at words. We're going to look at language, and we're going to look at how language plays a very important role in our understanding of gender, not just in terms of how we learn about gender, but also how we conceptualize genders, gender roles, gender identity, etc. So what does Dr. Schulist mean when she says that words matter? Well, it's captured in this first statement here, that language reflects our values and the beliefs of a culture. And it includes changes to those beliefs and values because language also changes over time, right? Language as a critical part of culture is just like culture in that it adapts, it changes over time to reflect, again, changes in the culture more broadly. Now, all cultures have differences in how men and women and other genders communicate because, again, all cultures distinguish gender socially as well. And so we see variations then in language, in speech, in written word, in all of the various forms of language communication as a result of how we're socialized to express ourselves, right? And there are norms, gender norms around what are appropriate and inappropriate ways of, again, we've talked about this, thinking and feeling and speaking. Now, the variations in terms of language itself can be very slight or they can be very extreme. And so because this is a course where language is our mode of instruction, we're going to focus on English language, but throughout I've tried to pepper various other examples, either from my own experiences or from the anthropological world that show some of these variations. So I took Japanese for 5 years, and so one of the things that's interesting to me that I remember learning about is that different words will be used by the speaker depending on what the speaker's gender is, but also on the gender, age, and status. So basically the overall identity of the listener themselves. And a lot of this relates to, again, not just gender norms relating to interpersonal relations, but also to age-based norms, right? That deferential language is used when speaking to elders, for example. And you would not speak to elders the same way you would speak to your peers. And it's not just in terms of intonation, but it also affects the vocabulary, the phrasing, and even the types of things, the content of your conversations will vary on the basis of age and gender. And I'm sure many of you can think of examples where this also applies to you as well. So what are some of the variations? Well, through the notes here, I presented examples in intonation. So intonation is a combination of pitch, volume, and rhythm. So dynamic patterns, for example, are interpreted as indicating more emotionality and natural impulses, right? So this kind of blurting, this kind of expressiveness, there's a kind of a gender norm or gender stereotype that women are more expressive in terms of this. Whereas men, on the other hand, are seen as being more in control because, again, normative male speech is associated with kind of narrow or monotonic ranges. And again, these are seen as being less kind of blurty. The speaker is more control, more deliberate and intentional in terms of what they're speaking, right? Another thing that we see in terms of intonation is that women frequently use raised pitch levels at the end of a declarative statement. And we do this in speech to often indicate a question, right? So, saying, are you done? Right? Are you done is a statement, or you are done is a statement. You are done, right? So raising that pitch at the end, or are you done, indicates a question, right? The problem is that we associate questioning with other characteristics as well, right? As being uncertain or lacking assertiveness or being hesitant. And this is, again, strongly associated with women. However, studies have also shown that dynamic patterns of speech, changes in pitch and volume in particular, are really useful for capturing the attention of your listener. So it's been argued that this may be a mechanism that women are using to secure a response from the hearers, simply that, yes, I'm listening, or, again, you are done? Yes, right? It invokes a response in the listener. Another variation we can see in terms of intonation relates to, again, kind of stereotypical patterns of speech. And one that's been looked at by anthropologists quite a bit is the use of vocal fry and uptalk. So when I was growing up, uptalk was the kind of Valley Girl speech of the 1990s. Like, oh my God, did you totally see what she was wearing the other day? That's so not appropriate, right? So that's kind of what uptalk's related to. There's a lot of declarative statements, again, have this high rising kind of questioning intonation at the end. This kind of uncertainty was kind of associated with being kind of, I remember we used to say it was like kind of being like bubble-headed or being kind of oblivious or maybe not as smart. In a contemporary setting, we're still seeing the use of uptalk, but it's often associated with vocal fry. I do this a lot without even realizing it. It involves a lowering of pitch. So instead of that rising intonation, there we have a lowering of pitch, and it often has this kind of creaky or gravelly sound that's associated with it. So this is an example of me attempting to use vocal fry. Now, the thing about vocal fry is that when you think about it, it can be really hard to produce, but a lot of women in particular, again, this is a gendered form of speech, do it intentionally. And so I've posted some links here that talk about vocal fry and uptalk. And so these are not produced by anthropologists, but rather just kind of looking at them more broadly. So again, vocal fry is often associated with people like Kim Kardashian. The Kardashians made it fairly famous, but a lot of other public figures, public female figures also use vocal fry as well. And the vocal fry speaking with Faith Sally, Faith not only demonstrates this, but talks a little bit around the stereotyping of it, and again, how we then interpret the status and again, the intelligence of individuals based on these, again, variations of patterns of speech. And then finally, I posted a link to a little article here talking about an anthropologist's take on this. And again, how it's really interesting how vocal fry and uptalk is perceived between members of the same gender. So when young women are using this to speak with each other, it becomes a mechanism for kind of solidarity and showing group identity and again, gendered identity versus being something that's seen as negative. So the reason why I want to talk about vocal fry and uptalk is not only because they're gendered speaks, but they're gendered ways of speaking, but they're ones that are associated with stereotypes, both very negative and positive. We can also have some grammatical variants. And so I should just mention that, again, these are fairly comprehensive studies of English that these conclusions have been based of. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. Not everyone follows these normative patterns. But one of the things they found in terms of grammar was that females typically use more standard grammatical forms. So what we might call more correct ways of speaking, whereas males are seen as preferring non-standard forms of speech, so speaking with greater instances of kind of slang, not using complete sentences, etc. Again, we'd have to examine why some of the reasons for this would be, and this is not a very intersectional approach. This was just looking at grammar, but we could see how things like class, educational levels, etc., may impact these things. Of course, English as a secondary language or tertiary or even fourth or fifth language, all of these might impact it as well. And I can't remember these studies if they were looking at English language, like birth speakers, people who are raised speaking English in a primary English environment or not. So again, some of these other factors influence this as well. A grammatical variant too that we see are the use of tag questions and effective tags. And so this relates also to what I mentioned relating to intonation. So tag questions are sentences in which a speaker makes a declarative statement that adds a tag in the form of a question about the declaration. So declarative statement would be, it's cold. Yes, it is cold. It's November in November. But a tag question would be to state something like, it's cold, isn't it? And again, what's important about tag questions is that they invoke a response in the listener, right? Because just saying it's cold, period, right? That kind of shuts down the conversation. Someone can choose to respond to it or not. But when someone asks you a question, it's cold, isn't it? You feel compelled to respond, right? So you're, yes, it is cold, or it's not that cold, or yes, it's going to get colder, or whatever, right? It invokes that response. And so there's been some arguments around how some of these patterns that we see in these English variations related to women and to the female gender tend to relate to women seizing power in conversations, right? That this is a mechanism for ensuring that they're being heard by invoking questions and responses from their listeners. And affective tags are also like this as well. Affective tags, on the other hand, tend to have a softening approach. So this is where we make a statement, and then we add, again, a tag question that is meant to indicate our speaker's concern or interest in the person we are addressing the statement towards, but again, kind of softens it, right? So "you're driving fast" is a pretty firm declarative statement. But you're driving fast, aren't you? Or you're driving kind of fast, right? So using adjectives to soften is, again, seen as a strategy that's used by the speaker to not only be heard, but to have what they're saying be listened to, right? It's kind of this notion that if you just make a declarative statement, that it can be combative or argumentative, but by adding these affective tags, again, like I said, it adds this overall softening effect. Okay, so those are some just basic variants if we just want to look at how language is being used, but broadly, we can look at language to look at how it intersects with gender. And so we've already looked at, for example, in the fairy tale of the egg and the sperm, how we define concepts as also influenced by our construction of gender. And so below, and I've linked here the work of my colleague, Dr. Sarah Schulis, about how sexist language presents itself even in how we define words. And so this was part of a Twitter thread that happened back in 2016 when Michael Oman Regan indicated that the Oxford English Dictionary, which is one of the premier dictionaries in the world, right, uses rabid feminist as an example of rabid in the dictionary, right? And so Oxford Dictionaries, whoever was running their social media account, responded in a way that was seen as very inflammatory, and noted that, they said stuff like, "our example sentences come from real world use and aren't definitions." And then, of course, everyone jumped back and they're like, no, the dictionary literally provides definitions for words. And just because something is used as such in the real world doesn't mean it's actually appropriate. And potentially by normalizing this in the dictionary, you're contributing to everyday sexism, right? So again, in the notes below and in this link, there's a further discussion of this. We could also look at word usage. There's a study that was done by Yasik in 2015, looking at words that are used to describe professors on Rate My Professor, right? Everyone's favorite terrible website. Okay. And they saw some really common patterns. So for example, here, they found that male faculty members are more likely to be described as funny, brilliant, genius, and arrogant, whereas female faculty members were more likely to be described as stylish, approachable, helpful, nice, and bossy. So the question that kind of resulted from this was, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because let's think about the words that are being used to describe professors and how they actually reflect, or, and more importantly, don't reflect what professors actually do, right? We are instructors. We're supposed to be teaching you. We're supposed to be presenting information and informing you, right? And some of these terms that are presented are useful in terms of potentially getting at that professor's style and their approach to teaching, but others aren't. So why does it matter if a faculty member is stylish or not, right? Approachable is really important, but think about how this is kind of a gendered notion, that we have high expectations in terms of emotional labor for females overall to be approachable and helpful, right? Think about the difference between arrogant and bossy, and also look at, again, that a lot of the descriptors being used for female faculty members are different than those for males in terms of assessing things like intelligence, right? That, again, there's more emphasis placed on the ability of not the ability, but how a female faculty member is stylish over them being brilliant or genius or competent at all over teaching. And so again, this is one of the really problematic things we have to consider, is that when we're evaluating professors, or even when I'm evaluating students, how gender is influencing the language I'm using to describe them. And remember that these kind of things are really critical, because when you use this gendered language then in teaching evaluations, this then contributes to overall inequality in academia, right? That male instructors are, again, defined as being brilliant to genius, and female faculty members are being stylish and approachable. So who's going to get the promotion when it comes to being, a more effective teacher? Well, the writing's on the wall. Okay. So here's an example. So one of the things that resulted from this was that Ben Schmidt created a mechanism or a metric for recognizing the appearance of words on Rate My Professor. And so you can click on this link and go in and just type in various sorts of words. And what they'll show you is they divide the frequencies of this use of these terms, not just by gender, and again, it's uses per million words of text, but also by discipline. And so again, you can see that there's both negative and positive consequences of this. So for example, that if we look at the highest usage and the highest kind of discrepancy between the uses, that female music instructors, for example, are much less frequently, so only about 20 words per million words of text to be described as geniuses, whereas male music instructors are described as genius 80 usage per million words of text. And then if we look at anthropology down here, you'll see that's a pretty wide gap, that male professors is somewhere around 30 and female professors it's somewhere around 10. How about we look at stylish then? We reverse this and let's see what the frequency is. And you can see that overall that female instructors are described as stylish much more than male instructors. A couple of exceptions here in education, physics, and chemistry, which I thought was kind of interesting. It also shows a little bit of a kind of a bias that we might have in terms of our expectations of our professors in different disciplines, right? So we might expect, for example, professors teaching something like fine arts, stylish to be something more important as a metric of who they are and their ability to teach versus in something like physics, which might be why we never see it being used. Here, again, this is something I thought that was really interesting, that we have this really wide gap in anthropology, that male instructors in anthropology have never been described as stylish, but female professors, we see about 1.5 usage. So again, you can see that stylish isn't used as frequently as genius, but you can still see that there is a significant gender gap in how these terms are used. So again, you can click on this link and play around, come up with some other words and see what some of the trends are in terms of the terminology that's being used, and also think about how these terms impact the types of professors you want to have, and actually may, again, or may not reflect their actual qualities as an instructor. We can also think about conversations. This is another approach to addressing gender difference in language. And we do have here in the West a cultural stereotype that females are more talkative than males, and we see this through media representations. And my favorite example of this is the Gilmore Girls, because the women on that show talk so incredibly fast, right? So not only do they talk a lot, but they talk at an incredibly rapid rate. It's like they're trying to get out as many words as they possibly can. But what's interesting is that while we do have some examples of the stereotype being represented, like I said, like Gilmore Girls, that, as I note here, experimental research analysis of patterns in the media on the amount of talk actually demonstrate the opposite pattern, that overall what we see is that in terms of who is speaking in our media, it is male. So there's this really fun site you can go to. Again, it's a couple of years old now, but it's meant to represent the largest ever analysis of film dialogue. And so you can see here that they took 2,000 screenplays and they broke down the dialogue by gender. And what each of these dots represent is the number of screenplays where the percentage of the words spoken are either male on one side or female on the other side. And what you can see is that the majority of films, the majority of dialogue is being spoken by males. And then we can also add in age as a factor. So again, among 2,000 screenplays, all genders, all years, that we actually see a very clear bias, that the majority of women speaking, for example, are between the ages of 22 to 31. Whereas for males, it's significantly older, between 42 and 65. And we'll talk a lot about this age difference and representation, about how young women and old males is the norm in media, and some of the consequences this has in terms of, again, representation and gender roles, etc., that happens. So again, what's interesting is that they mention here that the dialogue available to women who are over 40 years old decreases substantially, whereas for men it's the exact opposite, that there's just simply more roles available to older actors overall, but older male actors. There's also been some really interesting studies that have been looking at Disney films, for example. So I break this down a little bit more in the notes, but one of the things is that they've broke into the kind of three major Disney periods. And what they wanted to look at and see, again, how if the number of words being spoken and the amount of dialogue being presented by characters might reflect gender norms more broader in society. And what's interesting is one of the things they found was that actually female characters spoke more in the earlier Disney films, and the later Disney films, which we see as being a lot more intersectional, a lot more diverse, we actually don't see this same sort of representation. And it's really critical actually with the kind of Disney Renaissance period, which is the films that came out beginning with the early Little Mermaid in 1989 and continuing through to Milan, that while we have, you can see that the main films here, that 4 out of the 5, the main character is, or one of the main characters is female, right? But you can see that very little dialogue is actually spoken by female characters. The majority is still by males. And what might surprise some of you is even Frozen, which is kind of seen as like a hallmark of like feminist filmmaking, right? We have 2 sisters. It's an alternative love story. But what was interesting is that less than 50% of the dialogue is actually spoken by the female characters, that the majority of dialogue and the number of speaking roles based on number of characters is male as well. So what they've said is that one of the things that's happened is that we've seen a shift to larger casts, which is meant to incorporate larger diversity, different kinds of voices being represented. But actually what it's done is it's increased the amount of inequity in terms of spoken roles. Okay. Stepping aside from pop culture, people like Weston Zimmerman have studied two-person interactions. And one of the things they're starting to look at is, or what they started to look at was not just how much was being spoken, but other key characteristics of conversations, including interruptions. And so what they found was that there's a very clear difference in patterns of overlap, which is just simply mistakes in timing, where you think the person has stopped and then you accidentally speak over top of them, versus direct interruption, where you're violating the current speaker's turn. And they wanted to look at what happens in same-sex and cross-sex conversations. And what they found was that in same-sex conversations, overlap and interruption are evenly distributed. However, in cross-sex conversations, almost all of the interruptions, all of the intrusions were initiated by men. So they go on then to look at, well, why is this the case? And one of the things they concluded is that interruptions are a mechanism for power and control in interactions with women. And so they went on in their later study to go, well, how does power relate this? So they wanted to look at workplace environments, and they wanted to see what happens when, for example, you have a female boss with a male employee. Like, is he going to interrupt her just as much or more, or is the power going to level it up? And what they found was that no, it didn't really change, was that the interruption still continued. And they said that this is really interesting, whether they're acquainted or not. Because again, what the interruptions serve to do is disregard the current speaker's talk and attempt to allow that person, to disallow that person an opportunity to fully express themselves as they had intended. And what they found too was that not only was it stopping that person from speaking, stopping that person from articulating their thoughts or getting their point across, but often was used to control what topics of conversation, that often the interruptions were meant to change the topic. So not only were people's voices, the person who was being interrupted, largely women, was not being heard, but then they were then having to pivot because the conversation now was being redirected along another line, usually on the interests of the interrupter. Okay. Oh yeah, so it was Woods who did the workplace one. So again, so West and Zimmerman were just looking at people who knew each other versus people who didn't, same sex versus cross sex. And then Woods wanted to look at the same phenomena, but looking at what happens when you have superiors and subordinates and how that happens. And what Woods also looked at, the extra level they looked at, was the ability to succeed in their interruptions, because anyone can interrupt, but if people ignore them, if they continue to speak, then it's not a quote unquote successful interruption. And so this is what they found, was that higher status males were more likely to be able to successfully interrupt their co-participants, and were also least likely to be interrupted, while female interrupters were actually just less likely to succeed in their interruptions, regardless if they were a superior or a subordinate. And keeping in mind that they were also interrupting less frequently as well. Okay, so then we have 2 readings. One is Dubuk, which also looks at the workplace and is in particular looking at the language of women at work and the concept of code switching. So please review the reading and go over the points that I've summarized here, discussing the importance of this. And again, this comments on some of the points I made earlier around kind of Mother-y strategies are using motherly patterns or softening patterns that allow us to express concern or scold people, but still not be disruptive. Again, creating kind of solidarity and intimacy, right? Like, you're driving kind of fast, aren't you? Expresses concern without, kind of shutting another person down, as kind of having someone else question their own behavior versus being like, stop driving so fast, right? That kind of declarative statement. So I've already mentioned some examples of vocabulary, and in the notes here, I go over quite a few more other variations or in the English language by which we can talk or we explicitly provide or present gender distinction. And so you can consider, again, some of the exemplars we have of male and female, and then we have a couple of counter examples. We can consider descriptors or adjectives. So Dr. Schulis wrote an amazing blog post about how girls is often used to describe women, and how this kind of use of language that kind of infantilizes or the diminutive versions kind of decreases the value of women and, again, places them in a subordinate position. Of course, we also have labor titles. There's been a lot of discussion about this, about some of the stereotypes that are associated. And again, they're negative. They can be negative in both ways, right? Again, remember when we talked about toxic masculinity, that not all masculinity is toxic, but sometimes labor titles, when they're gendered, can be toxic. And male nurse is an example of it, that it suggests, again, that it's quote unquote not natural for men to be nurses. And then there's stereotypes that are associated with this as well. Of course, there's a lot of talk about how female astronaut, right? Well, why are we clarifying that? Astronauts are just astronauts, right? And then a lot of shifts now to teach children using gender neutral terminologies, right? So firefighter versus fireman, right? And there's a lot of socialization studies that have shown that it's important to use gender neutral language, because otherwise children struggle to conceptualize other genders in those roles. If all you've ever heard is fireman, all of a sudden it becomes shocking and weird and different for there to be a firewoman. But if you just refer to firefighters, then children can imagine anyone performing that role. And of course, this applies not just to gender, but to age, to ethnicity, etc., right? So he and man is another issue that's been widely contested, right? That by using mankind instead of humankind, this has kept women invisible in the archaeological record, and in some cases has trivialized women's experience. And I have some discussion a little bit below, and here's some images. Just Googling history, what you see a lot of representation of men. Where are the women? And in this case, where are the women? Well, they are cowering in fear with the children, which is their responsibility, while the men do the big things by revolting against whatever they're revolting against. Okay, so I already mentioned this around gender neutral language, the importance of this. It relates not just to gender, but also to marital status. Again, this is that idea of privileging not just heteronormativity, but also monogamy and heterosexuality. So this is why pronouns are really critical, using terminology like people and person, especially for people in occupations and positions of power. And note that Service Canada recently has banned gender-specific terminology, attempt to be more inclusive, right? So rather than talking about mothers and fathers, now they're talking about parents. And so I love this little image here. I think I've used it before, that again, if we just refer to doctors as doctors, then this child here can conceptualize a doctor as anyone, including themselves. Okay, here's a couple of cross-cultural examples. This was, again, something I pulled from a Twitter thread that was really interesting, where Shams talked about the translation to English from Turkish, and said that what's kind of showing the bias that sometimes exists in our culture and in our language is that Google Translate was adding gender into a gender neutral language, right? That there's no he or she, only O. And so we have this example here that Obir Asai, I believe it is how it's pronounced. I'm sorry, I don't speak Turkish. She is a cook. Well, really, it should just be they are a cook, right? It should be just a gender neutral. He is an engineer. He is a doctor. She is a nurse. And what this user was showing out is that, again, look how gendered this is, right? Why can't it be she is a soldier, right? One of the few examples is she is a police, right? And another example would be he is a secretary, right? So the question is, well, who's doing this? Well, whoever the programmer is behind, or programmers are behind Google Translate, is that they were building in this kind of gendering mechanism based on their own cultural values. Okay. So again, female subordinate status is something that's very common in English when it comes to naming, that a lot of female names are derived from male sources. I know this applies to other languages as well. And this is interesting when we start to look at things like who gets to be junior. So I know Beyonce had raised some controversy, and I believe that's what this post is about this idea of junior only belonging to male heirs and descendants versus why don't we use that for describing women? Well, a lot of it has to do with patriarchal systems. We can talk about how names matter in terms of gender inequality in the workplace. And so here's a couple of links, and I describe the scenario below. But basically what happens, as is described in Martin's thread, is that Martin works with a person named Nicole, and Martin and Nicole were in a supervisory position. And Martin one day ended up emailing this person who was being really rude to them. It says dismissive, ignoring their questions, arguing with him. And all of a sudden he noticed that thanks to a shared inbox that he shares with Nicole, he'd been signing off his communications with Nicole. And Martin realized that it was Nicole he was being rude to, not to him. So he said, hey, this is Martin. I'm taking over this project for Nicole. And Martin noted an immediate improvement, positive reception, thanking for suggestion, responding promptly, saying great questions, became a model client. So he's saying, no, my technique never changed. The only difference was I had a man's name now. So he asked Nicole if this happened. Her response, I mean, not all the time, but yeah, a lot. So they did an experiment where for 2 weeks they switched names. And what was his result? Well, he concluded that folks, it fucking sucked. Because he said that basically clients who had previously never had any problems with were having arguments with him, including one asking him if he was single, thinking it was Nicole, right? And so he said that, again, this was made him realize as her supervisor that it wasn't that he was better at the job, that he had an invisible advantage. They eventually took this to their boss. There ended up being a big dispute, which is outlined in the emails or the links that I provided to you. But again, it just shows that this is what's really crazy. And for him, it was shocking, but for her, she was used to it. She just figured it was part of her job. And she just took it in stride, right? That she knew that she was being treated differently, not just because of her job, but because of her gender. And she just accepted it as normative. And for him, it was shocking, and it was an awareness or an awakening that this kind of gender inequity existed. And so I always use this to explain, this is often why many of your female instructors will ask you to refer to them as doctor, because we don't get, in many cases, the benefit of that being our default title, even though it's something that we've learned, right? Or we've earned. And so, I myself have been approached and asked if I knew who the professor of this class is. Not so much since I switched to MacEwan, but at other institutions this frequently hafted. Students frequently refer to me as Ms. or as Mrs. or just by first name. And when I just informally surveying my colleagues about this, none of them have ever had this problem. They're almost always given a title, even if they don't even have a doctorate. So this is a really interesting example of how our language can sometimes reflect the gender bias we have. Then our last reading for this term is the work of Pyle. We'll talk about this a little bit more. I wanted to use this reading to come back and revisit something we introduced at the beginning of the term, which is two-spirit. And so this is a lovely article wherein Pyle is examining the use of this term, not only to provide us with some perspective of, well, why is two-spirit part of our contemporary lexicon relating to this indigenous gendered identity, but also some of the anthropological work that's been done on it and how that this has served to shape two-spirited identity as well. So some key things that Pyle takes away from this is that there is a disconnect between the historical or the traditional use of this term, of this identity, and also in a contemporary setting, but also how this is the product of things like colonialism, but also how anthropologists have contributed to this as well. So I'm looking forward to having discussion about two-spirit language and naming and the importance and significance of this in our class this week. Okay. And then the last thing I just encourage you to do is then also revisit our work by McIntosh, looking at tradition and threat, or the use of obscenity. I think this is really important because recent studies in the last few years have come out showing that actually women in the West use swearing and profanity much more and much greater than males do, and even including the intensity of the swearing itself. And so I just wanted to share with you this lovely quote because I think that it captures in many ways why many women do swear, right? That becomes an important tool in defying, disobeying, and disrupting the patriarchy and its rules, right? That one of the things that around language and gendered language is that women are again, and we've seen examples of this in the readings and what I've presented here, that women are expected to be nice and polite and quieter and softer and questioning, right? And so by using profanity, by making declarations like fuck the patriarchy, women can seize power, right? And challenge these norms in a very meaningful, tangible sort of way. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts and having a discussion with you. And I'm sure you'll all have some great examples to illustrate some of these points. And I hope that we can bring in some other cross-cultural perspectives, and some of you will be willing to share your experiences with gendered language in other languages other than English. So take care, everyone.